Ever since I was a kid, I've always had a love for camping. The forest has always felt like a second home to me. So, when the chance came, I invited my roommate, who's also one of my best friends, to join me for a camping trip. Naturally, he agreed. We picked a spot in a northern forest near my parents' hometown. During the day, everything was fine, and we had a great time. However, things took a strange turn around 3 a.m. We were woken up by what sounded like people singing. We hadn't been drinking much, and we don't use drugs, so this was beyond weird. It sounded almost like a religious chant or something similar. We both jumped out of the tent to investigate. There was nothing in sight, though, except for what little my friend's poor flashlight revealed. The singing seemed to be coming from a distance, but not too far away. Before we could even think about whether we should check it out or go back to sleep, something suddenly raced past me. It felt like a strong gust of wind, but it was powerful enough to knock my friend off his feet. I still have no idea what it was, but when I looked in the direction it had gone, I swear I saw a naked man over 2 meters tall for just a split second. After that, it disappeared. I rushed to check on my friend, only to find that he was unconscious. Panicked, I ran to find a spot with a signal to call for help. I found a place with just enough reception to dial, but as I did, I'm certain I saw a hooded figure about 10 meters away, watching me. It vanished quickly, but I figured it was just my adrenaline playing tricks on me in the dark. I hurried back to my friend and stayed with him until help arrived. It's been over 2 weeks since that night. My friend is still in a coma, though the doctors are hopeful. But honestly, I still don't understand what happened. The hooded figure might have been a figment of my imagination, but I know the tall, naked man was real. I'm just at a loss for what any of it could have been. If anyone has any thoughts or explanations, I'd love to hear them. It was a typical day, and I was outside playing with my dog, Harley, an English bulldog who was as friendly as could be. My aunt eventually called me inside to go to bed, and although I was disappointed to leave my dog, I went inside and got into bed. Not long after, my uncle came into my room, gave me a hug, and tucked me in. An hour later, I put the Goofy movie into the VHS player, but suddenly, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't fear or a sense of being watched, but more like familiarity, like I was in the presence of someone I knew. I wasn't scared, just curious. I looked up, and there, standing in my room, was a figure at least 6'4" or 6'6" tall, wearing a long trench coat that reached the ground and a broad-brimmed hat. What I saw was completely black, darker than the dark room I was in, and entirely featureless. Even though I could barely make out details, I didn't feel scared or paralyzed. I felt safe, almost as though the figure was a friend, so I said hello and snapped my fingers to check if I was awake. I stared at the figure for about 10 minutes, then waved at it. The moment I did, the figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I was left lying in bed, completely stunned by what had just happened. I went back to watching the movie, and everything returned to normal. No further strange occurrences took place that night. What stood out the most about this experience was that I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt calm and curious, as if I had encountered a long-lost friend. The figure's presence didn't feel threatening, it almost seemed to reassure me. Although I didn't feel any danger, the experience left me with an odd sense of curiosity, as though there was some hidden meaning to the encounter that I may never fully understand. Even now, the memory of that shadow figure still puzzles and fascinates me. If you're enjoying the stories so far, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. A few weeks ago, I shared a story about possibly being watched by someone lurking outside my house. If you remember, I saw someone walking around outside near the side of the house, and the burglar lights by the free library my parents had set up turned on. To sum it up, nothing happened after that night. But the very next night, I was on a phone call with a friend when I saw someone standing outside, completely hidden in the darkness. I reacted by loudly talking about how a creep was watching me, telling them to watch out. Looking back, I know it was a bit foolish, but it seemed to work because things calmed down after that, or so I thought. Tonight, though, was one of my oldest friends' last nights in town. I was out till about 9:30, dropped 2 friends off, then drove home. It was still early, so I wasn't too worried, but I stayed alert. I ended up driving down the side street where I had seen the person last time, even though it was out of my way. Everything seemed normal, but I did notice that one of the new houses being built had its lights on, which didn't seem strange at the time. An hour later, though, I started hearing a strange, loud banging sound from across the street. I know it's risky, but I wasn't going to let some horrible person dictate my comfort. I've been keeping an eye out for any activity, almost as if I'm trying to catch them in the act. I also keep my window open, as usual. So, yeah, it was probably pretty dumb to taunt them the other night by talking about someone watching me. But anyway, everything seemed to settle down, so I brushed it off, which ended up being a huge mistake. Not long after, the banging started again, but this time, I could actually feel it. It was coming from inside the house, and that's when I truly freaked out, knife in hand, crouched on the bedroom floor, my ear pressed to the door. The sound was hollow, not coming from the front door. I called 911, worried they'd just think I was overreacting. Still in shock, I was relieved when the dispatcher took me seriously and said someone would be on their way. For context, the police department is only a few minutes away from my house. I quietly made my way downstairs to check things out, and when I got to the front window, my heart dropped. There was no one at the door. But then, the banging started again, and this time, I could tell it was right outside. I went over to the side window that overlooks the garage, and that's when I saw him. He was dressed in all black, his hood pulled far over his face, banging wildly on the garage door with a crowbar. I honestly have no idea why he wasn't using the crowbar to break in or do something else, but I'm beyond grateful he didn't. The door that leads from the garage into the house is always left unlocked. To say I panicked is a massive understatement. I nearly would myself, which, in that situation, seemed completely justified. There I was, peeking through the window, watching this guy wail on the garage door, thinking just how unhinged he must be. All I wanted was for the cops to get there, but like before, he suddenly bolted and ran off. I had literally just finished giving my statement to the officers who showed up. My family woke up to talk to them too, since they're the homeowners, and now they're just as freaked out. My dad even ordered 4 exterior cameras to monitor the house. I really don't think it's over either. This guy seems to have some reason for targeting my house, maybe even me, since he started off by watching outside my window. Whatever the case may be, we're seriously thinking about security now and figuring out what steps to take next. Back in 2001, when I was a senior in high school, I started dating my first girlfriend, and I was absolutely smitten with her. Her family welcomed me as if I were one of their own, so I spent a lot of time at their house after school. My girlfriend and I would get home before her parents returned from work, so we would often hang out in the kitchen, snacking and doing homework. One day, she came downstairs, walked normally at first, but then quickly darted down the hallway to get back to the kitchen where I was sitting at the table. I asked her why she was acting so strange. She told me that when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw an older man with a long, white beard standing in the study. I went to check and found nothing there. I asked her if she thought she'd seen a ghost, but she was unsure. She said that whatever it was, that's exactly what it looked like. I half joked, questioning how the house could be haunted, especially since they were only the second owners, and the house wasn't even a decade old. Before the neighborhood was developed, the area had just been woods. Time passed, and eventually, I forgot about it until I had my own experience. One day, I walked into the kitchen, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a man sitting at the head of the dining table, which was just off to the right of the kitchen. He was wearing what looked like a green velvet suit, something completely out of place for the time. I turned my head fully to look, but there was nothing there. I told my girlfriend about what I saw, but I ruled out the possibility that her earlier experience had somehow influenced my imagination. I should mention that while I do believe there's more to life than we can typically perceive, I remain quite skeptical. Fast forward to the summer when her friend from Brazil came to visit for their winter break. My girlfriend and I were in her room, being teenagers, when her friend, who had been giving us some space, suddenly burst through the door in tears. She was speaking rapidly in Portuguese, describing how she had been downstairs listening to her CD player when she ran into a man with a long white beard in the study. This definitely convinced me. I realized there was no way my girlfriend had told her friend about her own experience, especially since the topic hadn't been discussed since and neither of them showed any particular interest in it other than what they personally seen. A few weeks ago, after my now ex-girlfriend had returned to the United States with her parents, we went out for dinner, and I decided to bring up the subject again. Her mom, without much emotion, casually mentioned, "Yeah, I saw people all the time, usually on the first floor and in the basement." I just never said anything because I wanted to stay strong for our kids. Then, her dad added that he was convinced they were meant to live in that house. While searching for a home in the neighborhood, he felt something told him they'd end up there. The very next day, the house went on the market, and he moved in shortly afterward. So now we have 3 separate accounts. I rule myself out, but I can't shake the thought that a harmless ghost with a similar description might have been present in that house. To this day, I still feel tempted to write a letter to the current family to ask if they've seen the bearded man, but I'm unsure. All of this took place in Connecticut, and I really would like to go back there someday to see the house again. My parents divorced in 1997 when I was 7 years old. My mother moved into my grandparents' old house, which they had recently vacated but hadn't sold. Since they had plenty of money, there was no issue with us moving in. We lived there for about 5 years, just my mom, my 2 older sisters, and our dog. What I'm about to tell you is in imperfect order since I can't recall the exact timing of everything, but I assure you everything I share is true. The house had 3 floors, the ground floor, the basement, and the upper floor where my sisters and I slept. The basement was the most terrifying part of the house. The stairs leading from the basement spiraled up to the 1st and 2nd floors, and the steps were old, creaky, making loud noises with each step. Several times a week, we'd hear footsteps slowly climbing up from the basement. They'd pause briefly at the ground floor before continuing up to the 2nd floor. Most of the time, the footsteps would stop outside my older sister's room, though it sometimes varied, stopping outside my room or my middle sister's room as well. We all heard it, but my mom never liked talking about it. My sisters and I would often talk about it the next day, confirming we had all heard the footsteps wherever they had stopped. We all dreaded going down to the basement. The basement was enormous, and you'd think children would enjoy playing in it, but we all absolutely hated it. Even our dog refused to go down there. She seemed to fear it as much as we did. Strange things would happen down in that basement. The lights would turn off by themselves, objects would move around, and sometimes you'd hear things shifting down there, even though nobody was supposed to be down there. One evening, my sisters and I were playing with walkie-talkies, trying to tune into the local police channel, like any typical kids in the 90s. But this time, the voice we heard on the walkie-talkie was different. It sounded much closer than usual. The voice began saying strange things, speaking directly to my older sister, even threatening to hurt her. It called her name, but it never responded to her questions. We were terrified, so we turned off the walkie-talkie. A minute later, our dog ran into our room, barking at nothing. Our dog, who was large and extremely protective of us kids, kept barking, which was completely out of character for her. She stayed in the room, continuing to bark, which had never happened before or since. On another occasion, it was just me and my mom at home, with my sisters and the dog out. I was up in my room playing, and my mom was doing something around the house. Then, suddenly, I heard loud footsteps coming from the basement. The sound grew louder as the footsteps quickly moved up from the basement and continued all the way to the second floor, right where I was. I remember my heart stopping as I listened to those footsteps. They were heavy, and they didn't sound like my mom's at all. There was an anger in the way they moved. The footsteps kept going until they reached outside my room. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut with such force that it shook the walls. I screamed and cried. My mom rushed upstairs, trying to open the door, but it was as if it had been locked from the inside, even though the door didn't have a locking mechanism. My mom yelled for me to stay calm as she ran downstairs to get tools to break the door open. As I sobbed, the door suddenly unlocked and swung open on its own. It was terrifying, and I couldn't explain how it had happened. Another time, when my sisters and the dog were away, a storm rolled in, and for some reason, I became absolutely terrified of the thunder. I had never been afraid of it before, but that night was different. Meanwhile, down in the basement, everything seemed to go haywire. We heard things being thrown around down there, glass shattering, something we confirmed in the morning when we found broken glass scattered all over the basement. Footsteps echoed up and down the stairs, and my mom and I huddled together, terrified of what was happening. At one point, we were sitting in the living room, clutching each other, when the front door suddenly flew open, slammed shut, then opened and closed again repeatedly for what felt like several minutes. We were too scared to move, holding onto each other until the storm eventually passed. When it did, everything went quiet, as if nothing had ever happened. It sounds like those years in that house were filled with unsettling experiences, and I can understand how hard it must have been to live through. It's interesting that the activities seemed to intensify when your dog wasn't around, as pets can often be more attuned to things that humans might miss. And the fact that the hauntings seemed to target your older sister more, including the creepy experience of seeing an old man watching her sleep, is certainly chilling. That must have left her with a lot of fear and confusion. It's great that you've been able to talk about it now and share these memories, even if they're difficult. If you ever feel like discussing more of what happened in the house, or if anything else comes to mind, feel free to share. It's understandable that a place like that would stick with you for years. How did your family feel about the decision to move after those experiences? Was there any sense of relief once you were in a new home? The house I grew up in, the same one where my parents and one of my brothers still live, has always been very active with what we call benevolent spirits. Just to give some quick background, I grew up sharing the house with two female spirits. I could feel their energy, had encounters with them, and I still notice their presence when I visit my parents. One of the most intense experiences happened in 2007 when I was 13. At that time, my brother was 12 and the twins were 7. It was a humid day with thunderstorm mornings and dark skies. It was late summer and the week had been filled with thunderstorms. Eventually, the storms knocked out the power, leaving the house dimly lit by candles and flashlights. My parents were in the garage trying to get our generator working so my mom could boil water for tea. Meanwhile, us kids, of course, were hoping to charge our Nintendo DSs since that was our obsession at the time. I was sitting in the basement with my brothers. We were all in the sectional, waiting for the power to come back on. Our DSs were all dead, and we weren't sure what to do next. My brother, Chad, told me he wanted to grab something from our bedroom that we shared, but he didn't want to go up alone. Knowing that he was afraid of the dark, I didn't question him further. We climbed the stairs from the basement, walked through the tiled hallway that connects to the kitchen, and then turned left to face the stairs leading to the second floor. It wasn't a very steep climb, only about 10 steps, but the space in front of us was pitch black. Suddenly, I felt a deep, foreboding sensation wash over me. I've always been in tune with my instincts and try to trust them, but this time, everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to react. As we pointed our flashlights up the stairs, a flash of lightning illuminated the hallway. From where my brother and I stood, you could see a hallway at the top of the stairs that only went about 12 feet before you hit the door to a linen closet. Standing in front of the linen closet at the end of the hallway was a woman. The lightning flash was so bright that it almost hurt my eyes, yet I could still clearly see her standing at the top of the stairs. She was dressed in a long skirt and a button-up shirt, but I couldn't pinpoint the exact time period of the clothing. All I knew was that it looked like it was from years, even decades, before 2007. The figure wasn't facing us. She was gazing off to the left, towards my other brother's room. An overwhelming sense of fear washed over me, but now I think it was more about the shock of seeing an apparition, not because the spirit seemed evil or threatening. After what felt like an eternity, Chad and I ran to the living room, jumped onto the couch, and sat there wide-eyed, staring into space, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. Fortunately, the rest of the evening passed without anything else paranormal or strange happening. We returned downstairs, played our Nintendo Wii, and tried to push the eerie encounter from our minds as the generator came back on. But even then, I couldn't help but wonder who that apparition had been. She seemed much younger than the other spirit we had named Tara. It was at that moment I realized it wasn't just Tara in our home. This woman would appear again in the future. Luckily for us, she was mostly friendly during those encounters. When I was about 15, my group of friends stayed over at the house of the leader of our friend group. His place was out in the most remote part of our rural town, pretty much in the middle of the woods. The house was completely surrounded by thick, dense trees. In the evening, we decided to head out and start a bonfire deep in the woods. We gathered everything we needed and made our way through the forest. On the way, he started telling us all the creepy things he had experienced out there, white, skinny figures peeking around his shed, staring at him and running off when he looked, strange screams and whispers from the woods, and figures watching him. It definitely set the tone for the night. By around 7 p.m., we had the bonfire going, and it was pitch black outside, as it was the middle of winter in New Hampshire. I remember just how eerie the whole vibe was. All we could see was the light from the fire, everything else was just a black wall of nothing. The forest was so still that the silence almost felt deafening unless we spoke. We eventually needed more firewood and other supplies, so the leader took me with him to go get it. We walked back to his house along a 1.5-mile trail in complete darkness, with no flashlight or light source. Everything felt fine, but it was still pretty unsettling. We were talking and joking around, having a good time, when the first strange noises started. My friend immediately told me to stop talking. To my left and right, I began hearing a mix of sounds: screaming, laughing, talking, whispering, shouting, and voices saying words I couldn't understand. It sounded like there were maybe 20 people around us. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I looked at my friend, who had his head down and was completely silent. Known for being a complete goofball and the fearless leader of our group, I had never seen him look so shaken and serious. The expression on his face still haunts me because it was so unlike him. He had always portrayed himself as the tough, fearless leader, so seeing him so visibly shaken was unsettling. I started to ask what was going on, but he cut me off, telling me to stay quiet, face forward, and ignore the sounds. I did as he asked, and the next few minutes were some of the most uncomfortable and terrifying of my life. I remember feeling sick to my stomach. By the time we reached his house, the noises had faded away. We grabbed what we needed in complete silence, and that's when I realized just how eerily quiet the night had become. There were no birds, no rustling of sticks, just silence. There was no sound, just an unnatural silence. We made our way back to the campsite, and nothing else happened that night, but it remains the most unsettling and bizarre experience I've had, with almost no explanation. While I'm still not ready to claim it was paranormal, whatever it was, it definitely terrified me. My father and uncle have a story of their time living on a reservation where they experienced something that still stands out to them: an encounter with a skinwalker. My grandmother taught at the school on the reservation, and while they lived relatively well compared to the native residents, their experience was vastly different from the locals. The Navajo Nation, with its deep-rooted lore, often leaves stories and experiences unspoken by older generations, especially to outsiders or non-natives. I apologize if I get any details wrong about the culture, practices, or traditions. I'm simply trying to relay the story that my family has only whispered about. My grandmother, father, and uncle lived on Navajo Mountain for several years, and their experience was starkly different from that of the Navajo people who had lived there for countless generations. I want to share their story and get insight from others who have lived in similar communities or heard stories about that time. My father and uncle are about 2 years apart in age, and during the 1980s, they lived on the reservation. At the time, my dad was between 10 and 12 years old, and my uncle was even younger. They spent most of their days outside, riding bikes with their friends, many of whom were native to the reservation. My grandmother, recovering from an abusive relationship with their father, wasn't overly concerned about their whereabouts since it was a small, quiet community. There wasn't much trouble to be had in that remote place, especially for young white boys on a reservation. However, the danger wasn't in trouble itself, it was Huadara. It was one of those typical nights with no parental supervision. The night felt unusually cold, and the sky seemed darker than anything imaginable. In such an isolated place, the stars would usually provide some light, but tonight it was as though the earth had slipped into another dimension, an abyss. The boys, as they did every night, rode together until they were compelled to stop, their brakes screeching in unison. Without speaking, they all looked up, and what they saw caused their faces to shift from youthful innocence to pure terror. They froze, their grip on their bikes tightening as every muscle and nerve in their bodies locked up. To their right stood a mesa they passed by daily, one they could see from their home, visible from my father and uncle's bedroom window every night. But tonight, that mesa became a symbol of fear. At its peak, a roaring fire towered above them, taller than any bonfire a group of people could create, almost as tall as the mesa itself. But even more terrifying was the sight of a pitch-black figure moving around the fire. The native boys with them explained that this was no ordinary Navajo ritual or dance. The boys' stomachs tightened in unease. Without saying a word, the native boys turned and ran back to their homes. My father and uncle, in a state of panic, dropped their bikes and sprinted back to the house. They rushed inside, breathless, and recounted what they had seen. But my grandmother, calm as ever, seemed unfazed by their frantic tale. The boys, still shaken by the events of the previous night, tried again to explain what they had seen. Their grandmother, however, dismissed them with a simple wave of her hand, telling them it was just a legend the natives spoke of. She shooed them away, urging them to stop worrying. The boys spent the rest of the night in their shared room, too terrified to speak to each other, their curtains drawn tight, afraid to look out the window and confirm the horrors they'd witnessed. The images of the fire and the dark figure haunted them, but eventually, the sun began to rise, spilling light into their room and providing a sense of relief as the darkness faded away. When they finally emerged from their beds, the boys went to the kitchen, hoping to once again convey the strange and terrifying events they'd encountered. But again, their grandmother didn't take them seriously. She seemed more concerned with her coffee and the morning newspaper than their disturbing story. Finally, she told them to go climb the mesa and investigate for themselves, perhaps to put their minds at ease. So, the boys gathered their friends, the same ones who had seen the mysterious event with them, and set out on their bikes. The friends stayed at the bottom of the mesa, their eyes fixed on the peak as my father and uncle began the climb, eager to uncover any evidence of the hellish fire they had witnessed the night before. The mesa wasn't very tall, only about the height of an average one-story house, so it took the brothers less than 2 minutes to reach the top where they had seen the horrifying scene the night before. When they reached the summit, they were met with a strange mix of relief and hysteria. There was no sign of the enormous bonfire, or any fire at all, on the mesa. The place was completely unchanged from the previous night. They climbed down, sharing the news with their friends who had also witnessed the terrifying sight. The native boys looked at them in shock, but none of them said a word. Without a word spoken, they quickly turned their bikes around and headed home, and from that moment on, the event was never discussed again. Despite my father and uncle's attempts to ask about it, neither their grandmother nor anyone else in the community would mention it again. My father, a skeptic who doesn't believe in anything paranormal, from ghosts to aliens, becomes visibly disturbed whenever the subject of the skinwalker comes up. His face turns pale, and he gets quiet and jumpy. It took a lot of pleading on my part before he finally shared the full story with me, and I could see the goosebumps and the hairs standing up on his arms as he recounted his experience. In 2019, my grandmother took me to Navajo Mountain to show me her history and to see how the Navajos still live on the reservation. According to her, very little had changed since the time they lived there in the 1980s. As I hiked and explored the reservation, I made sure to be respectful, mindful not to invade or disturb the sacred beauty of the Navajo land. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled over me. It was as if my very presence there was not right, as though I was intruding on something that wasn't meant for someone like me. It wasn't caused by the people or the community, it was more of a sensation that the land itself was heavy, almost as if I wasn't supposed to be there. The memory of that visit and everything I learned about the way of life on the reservation has stuck with me. I even climbed the mesa where my dad and uncle had witnessed the skinwalker ritual. Everything seemed normal at first, but as I stood in the middle of the mesa, a deep, unsettling darkness seemed to seep into me. It's hard to explain, but something shifted. Since that moment, I've never felt the same. I'm seeking some advice because I've been sensing a strange, unsettling presence in my house, specifically in the kitchen and living room, though they're not separated. I'm 20, and I live with just my mom. I'm not sure where to begin, but several unusual physical occurrences have happened in the kitchen while I've been home. I should mention that I moved into this house less than 2 years ago and have never had any previous paranormal experiences. I'll go ahead and list these encounters, starting with the earliest and working up to the most recent. The first event happened a couple of months after we moved in. My mom, who sleeps on the first floor, woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of wind chimes ringing in the kitchen. She went to investigate and saw the chimes moving, even though there was no wind. My mom has always loved wind chimes and kept some inside, but after that incident, we took them down. The second event was the first one I witnessed. Last winter, around November 2022, I was sitting on the couch with my ex-girlfriend, watching TV in the living room. We'd been there for about 35 to 45 minutes when suddenly, my lunchbox flew off the top of the refrigerator and landed about 5 feet in front of it. I paused the show, completely freaked out, since we were the only ones home at the time. I picked it up and put it back on the fridge, and my ex, already spooked, decided we should both head upstairs. I'm not sure if this detail matters, but afterward, I told my sister, who practices pagan witchcraft, about the incident. She read tarot cards for me a few times, and each time, she pulled cards with cats playing on them. She suggested that the spirit might be a deceased pet trying to get someone to play with it. She also performed a sage ritual. I'm not sure if any of this is significant or connected, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The third incident occurred just 2 days ago, and it was the second time I saw something for myself. I have a home gym, and sometimes I work out after work. 2 days ago, I was alone, working out in the basement. Once I finished, I went upstairs to the kitchen to make my protein shake, and I was planning to get some strawberries. There was always a creepy vibe in that room, but I tried to ignore it. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing strawberries and eating them, when I glanced out the window above the sink. By that point, the backyard was completely dark, so I couldn't see anything outside, just the reflection of the room behind me. As I looked up, I saw what seemed to be a blurry black figure moving rapidly from one side of the living room to the other. It only lasted about half a second, so I couldn't make out any details, or even if it had any features at all. When I say fast, I mean fast. It moved at the speed of someone sprinting full force across the living room. I immediately turned around, but there was nothing there. Freaked out, I started saying things like, "Whatever you are, you're not welcome here. You need to leave. This is my house." Afterward, I went upstairs and lay in bed until my mom came home because the creepy feeling only seems to go away when someone else is around. Eventually, I showered and went to bed. After this fourth incident, I debated whether to tell my mom. I didn't want to freak her out, especially since she sleeps on the first floor. But last night, I decided to share it with her, and she was understandably shaken. Then, this morning, she called me while I was at work and admitted she had been keeping things from me, too, because she didn't want to scare me. My mom runs a small business from the basement directly below the kitchen and living room. She told me that, at least a dozen times, she's heard footsteps walking around in the kitchen when she was certain she was home alone. This is apparently why she blasts her music so loud while she's down there. From our call, I found out she'd already contacted some people from her church, and they're arranging for someone who specializes in spirits to come check the house. Now, about the fifth and final incident, honestly, I'm not entirely sure if it was real or just in my head because I was under the influence that day. I'm experienced enough to function, so it wasn't my first time, but about a month ago, I decided to trip at home with my girlfriend and 2 friends. For most of the trip, we stayed upstairs watching TV shows. I highly recommend The Midnight Gospel on Netflix, by the way. One night while watching it, I had to head downstairs to use the bathroom. As I was walking down the stairs alone, I swear I saw what looked like a woman's face smiling at me in a disturbingly unsettling way. The face appeared to be on the couch, where I had some laundry piled up. I vividly saw the face within the laundry, and it unnerved me so much that I sprinted to the bathroom and then ran back upstairs for the rest of the night. I should also mention that in the mornings before work, around 5:45 a.m. when it's still pitch dark outside, and at night while I'm alone in the kitchen, I often feel an unsettling sensation, like someone is watching me. It's that heavy, almost paralyzing feeling of being observed, but every time I look around, there's no one there. Despite that, the sense of dread is overwhelming. My house is silent most of the time, with almost no noise from the outside since it's surrounded on 3 sides by trees. The isolation makes the eerie feeling even worse. Everything I've shared here is completely honest, and I've described my experiences to the best of my ability. I'd really appreciate any advice on how to get rid of this presence or energy because it's genuinely freaking me out. It's gotten to the point where I dread going into the kitchen or living room at night. It all began when I was around 14 years old. My younger brother and I decided to swap rooms, and from the very first night in my new room, strange things started to happen. Normally, I sleep soundly through the night, but suddenly, I began waking up at exactly 2:17 a.m. every single night. Each time, I had an overwhelming feeling that something or someone was watching me from the right corner of my room. It was always the same feeling. While I had experienced positive energy from spirits in the past, particularly from family members who had passed, this felt completely different. It was invasive and intimidating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was could see me, but I couldn't see it. Oddly, this never happened when I stayed at my mom's house, only at my dad's. As time went on, small strange occurrences started happening as well. I was staying at my mom's when my dad told me that my alarm clock radio had turned on by itself at full volume in the middle of the night, waking up the entire family. I hadn't been at his house for days. Then, when I returned home, my little brother and I were playing outside in the driveway. At one point, he ran inside to use the bathroom, but suddenly, a tennis ball flew out of the garage. It made no sense at all, considering my little brother was nowhere near the garage. One night, I heard papers shuffling on my desk, despite the window being closed. On another morning, I watched my dad's sunglasses on the kitchen counter move several inches by themselves while I was the only one awake. My older siblings started to believe me when random lights in the house began turning on by themselves. The strange part was that we noticed the paranormal activity mostly occurred when my little brother wasn't home. Fast forward to when the house was empty, with my parents away on vacation. My grandma would check in on the house with my siblings, and each time they returned, a new light would be on. On the last night before my parents returned, she triple-checked that all the lights were off. My parents were definitely surprised when they came home to find every light on in the house. My grandma swore our house was cursed and refused to visit again. My stepmom started believing in the paranormal stories too. One night, My older brother and I both heard footsteps running up and down the stairs when my little brother was at a sleepover. It really freaked us out. At one point, things even became dangerous when the gas stove burners turned on by themselves, set to low heat overnight. If any of this had been a prank before, I can assure you no one in our family would ever mess around with something that could put our lives in danger. My dad finally began to believe me about 8 months into the haunting when one night, after all the kids had gone home, he heard whispering in the hallway. He panicked, grabbed his knife thinking there was a robber, and when he opened the door, he found my TV had turned on by itself, with people talking on low volume. The last incident that happened was one night when I came out of the shower and went to change in my room. The mirror was foggy from the steam. My older brother knocked on my door and asked what I had written on the mirror. Confused, I went in to look, and we both sat in awe as letters slowly began to appear in front of us. The whole family quickly gathered around to try and decipher it, and it said, "I am watching," followed by a word we couldn't quite make out. Our family couldn't explain what we saw, and after that day, the occurrences suddenly stopped. I stopped waking up every night. There were no more footsteps. Nothing. A year later, my dad called me and said he had found something strange on my brother's birth certificate. He asked, "Didn't you used to say that Nick, our younger brother, was somehow connected to the haunted stuff that happened in the house?" After I confirmed, he casually mentioned that my younger brother was born at exactly 2:17 a.m. I was pretty much left speechless. There was no way this could have been a coincidence. From that day on, I was left with so many more questions than answers. 2 years ago, I had a meeting with a psychic medium, and after sharing my story, she explained that the entity had targeted me because I acknowledged its presence. She assured me that it was no longer in the house. She confidently told me that an entity like that often attaches itself to an object or a person who has since left, which makes me believe that something might be or might have been attached to my younger brother. When I was 9 years old, 2 of my sisters and I were almost kidnapped. We were visiting our paternal uncle in a small rural town in the U.S. One afternoon, my sisters, who were 8 and 6 years old, and I decided to walk a block or two to play at the elementary school playground. It was the summer of 1979, and the playground was close to the street and the school's parking lot. While we were playing, a man drove into the parking lot, got out of his car, and approached us. Right away, I felt uneasy. He started talking to us, and though I don't remember being specifically taught about stranger danger at that point, I did recall being told to always be polite to strangers. This man, however, was clearly trying to convince us to leave with him. I knew something wasn't right, so I tried to think of an excuse to leave. He offered us food, and I quickly said that my mom was making lunch. I remember him talking about finding or playing with a dog, but I kept watching him carefully, memorizing every detail of the situation. I kept urging my sisters to go, but they wanted to stay and play. Finally, the fire department bell rang, signaling noon, and I used that as my reason to leave. I told my sisters that Mom was expecting us home for lunch at noon. I grabbed both their hands, and we started running home. Just as we were a few steps away, the man called after us, offering again to show us his hot dog. I immediately replied, "That's okay. I think my mom is making hot dogs for lunch." I remember thinking to myself, "Chew on that," as we continued running. When we reached my uncle's house, my mom was indeed in the kitchen making lunch. Ironically, she was making hot dogs. I tried to tell her what had happened, but she wasn't paying attention. So I said, "Mom, the man wanted to show us his hot dog," and that's when she started to listen. I told her everything, and she immediately called my dad and uncle. They asked me to retell the story, and then my dad called the police. Officers came, and they sat down with my parents, my uncle, and the three of us girls. I repeated the story, and the officers asked us some follow-up questions. It seemed like my sisters hadn't recognized the danger as I had. The officers then asked me to describe the man and his car, and I was able to provide a lot of details. They seemed surprised by how much I remembered. They said they would try to find him, but they also pointed out that a major road ran through the town only a few blocks away, something my parents hadn't considered when they allowed us to play there. We never heard from the police about the incident, and we were never allowed to go to that school playground on our own again. I'm a 20-year-old female who recently moved into a new apartment with my boyfriend, who works away for long periods. An older man, around 50, started to become friendly with me when he found out I was new to the complex. I made the mistake of telling him that I live with my partner, but he's away for work. After that, he began knocking on my door almost every day and would wait for a response, leaving only after about 5 minutes if I didn't answer. One day, I was outside in the common area, playing with my brother and his 2 kids when I saw him coming toward me. I quickly picked up my brother, and he started talking to me, asking about him. He then tried to grab my brother out of my arms. I held him tightly and pulled away, and as my brother started crying, I made up an excuse about needing to feed him and left. That was the last time I went near him with my brother. I'm terrible with confrontation, so I didn't act on it immediately, but something just didn't feel right. A few days later, I heard a knock at my door and opened it without thinking. The man walked right past me into my apartment without saying a word, just smiling. I asked if he was okay, and he said, "Oh, I'm good. I just wanted to see what your place looks like inside." Then he started walking into every room. He checked my windows and commented, "So all your windows have bars on them except the bathroom?" I nervously laughed and said, "Yeah, I guess they do." I didn't know what to do, so I walked into the front garden, hoping he'd follow me out so I could get him away from my apartment without upsetting him. Once he was outside, I quickly shut the door and said I had to go to the store before it closed. Later that night, while I was hanging laundry, a neighbor, a 34-year-old woman, introduced herself. I told her about what had happened and asked if she knew the man. She said he'd been doing the same thing to her, and after hearing my story, she told her partner about it. He ended up going to talk to the older man. After that, the man only knocked on my door one more time, and I hid in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until he left. I haven't heard from him since or seen him around, but I wake up at night, sometimes panicking, thinking he might do something. The problem is my window is glass, so I can't even lock it. I spoke to the management, but they say there's nothing they can do since he's stopped now. I'm considering filing a report with the police to at least have it on record, but I don't know if anything will come of it. I just hope it doesn't escalate any further. My cousin and I are both 25 years old and share the same age. She's just 5 days younger than me. When we were toddlers, her family rented a floor in my parents' house, and we spent all of our time together. We were inseparable until we turned 5, when her family moved to a different city, about 30 kilometers away. The separation was hard on both of us, as we had developed a very close, almost codependent bond. 2 years later, we worked out a plan with our parents to visit each other every weekend. During the summer, we'd alternate staying at each other's house every week. This arrangement lasted for years. Since we were always together, by the time we were 10 or 11, we'd already explored all of our backyard adventures, tree climbing, building tree houses, setting up tents, and camping in the backyard. We were craving something new, so we decided to start fishing together every Friday by the river near my house, a 20-minute walk away. We didn't have any real fishing tools, just a butterfly net. On a good day, we'd catch a dozen small fish, which was enough for our little restaurant game. We'd dry the fish in the sun, arrange them on plastic plates, and serve them to our imaginary customers. We did this every week and always made sure to stay safe, never actually going into the river. It was a peaceful neighborhood, and the river, near the yellow bridge, was usually empty when we were there. But one day, things changed. I remember this moment clearly. We were around 10 or 11 years old. My cousin was staying with me, so we took the butterfly net and went to fish by the river. We sat under a large willow tree, enjoying the peacefulness when suddenly a man appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He was standing just a few meters away from us. His black hair had streaks of gray, suggesting he was in his late 40s or early 50s. He wore a dark blue t-shirt, which had a bit of a stain on the collar. He asked us what we were doing, and we told him we were fishing. He walked back and forth along the shoreline, which stretched for at least 500 meters. He could have gone anywhere, but he lingered right where we were. He moved a little closer, and we stood up, unsure of what to do. The man then shared that he was having issues with his wife, and we simply nodded, trying to keep the conversation as brief as possible, remembering the rule not to talk to strangers. We didn't ask him anything, hoping the situation would pass quickly. He pulled out a flip phone and, without warning, opened it in front of us. "I have to show you my wife," he said. We hesitated but responded with a quiet, "Okay." After a moment of searching through the phone, he came even closer, holding the phone towards us. On the screen was a picture of a completely naked woman sitting in a chair with her legs apart. We gave a small nod, not sure how to react. Then he started showing us more pictures, but it became obvious that the woman in the photos was not his wife, as the faces didn't match. The pictures were all inappropriate, disturbing, actually. The quality, the fashion, and the feel of the images made me think of outdated magazines from the 70s, as if he had taken them from old magazines or received them from someone else. I glanced at my cousin and silently mouthed, "It's not his wife." She nodded in agreement. "Isn't she beautiful?" he asked. "Yeah, she is," I replied, forcing a smile while my cousin nodded, still uncomfortable. We then remembered we had left our net by the river, so we quickly walked back to the willow tree to grab it. When we returned, he was still standing in the same spot, now focused on his phone. He began showing us more pictures, these ones of men and other women in suggestive poses. These images looked like they were taken with a flip phone camera. "This is me," he said, pointing to one of the men in the photo. We just nodded, trying to end the interaction, and told him we had to go home. But then he said something that has stayed with me since that day. "You think my wife is beautiful? She thinks you're beautiful too. She would love to meet you. Come with me, and we can play together." "No," I said firmly, feeling the panic rise in my chest. "We have to go home," I added. "You're such a party breaker," he said, turning to my cousin. "Maybe she doesn't want to go home. Come on. I want to play with you." "No. I really want to go home," my cousin responded, her voice shaking. After that, my memory of the events becomes a bit blurry, but I remember feeling terrified, like we had narrowly escaped something much worse. What I remember next is that he seemed to give up and disappeared, and we left, giggling and laughing as we walked home, mocking his voice and tone along the way. It wasn't until years later that the memory resurfaced, and I even wondered if I had dreamed it or imagined it. But his words kept echoing in my mind, so I decided to call my cousin and describe the situation word for word, just like I've done here. She confirmed that it did happen, though with a slight difference in her recollection. She explained that while all the details were correct, after she said she really wanted to go home, the man got too close. We were too scared to run or even turn our backs, thinking he might catch us. So we stayed there, pretending he wasn't there. We continued playing with the fish we had caught and talked about our fathers, pretending they were both in law enforcement, mine in IT and hers as a forest ranger, and that they were strong enough to take down a man with a single punch. The man didn't believe us, but he kept walking in circles around us, staying at a distance but always watching. We kept waiting, hoping he would leave. Eventually, he went into the bushes behind us to pee, and that was when we ran. We sprinted across the bridge and kept running until we reached the part of the neighborhood with more houses. When we were near my house, I suddenly stopped in the middle of the road, feeling like my legs wouldn't work anymore. My cousin helped me sit down at the side of the road, and we stayed there until I felt better. Once I did, we started joking around again. In hindsight, I realized that my experience was a state of shock. After a while, we got up, went home, and threw the fish away, both of us agreeing never to go fishing again. We never told our parents because we knew what had happened involved inappropriate content, and at that age, we thought it was something shameful that should never be discussed. My cousin said she was surprised that I had thought it was a dream and didn't remember it until now, given how extreme my reaction had been. She explained that she still has PTSD from that event, and even today, she refuses to go anywhere alone and feels terrified whenever the Yellow Bridge is mentioned. Thanks for watching. If these stories kept you on edge, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next chilling tale. See you in the next video.